Welcome back to another episode of Light Beer, Dark Money. I'm Sean Noble.
And I'm Chris Clements.
And we have today a very special guest, Chris Buskirk, who is the head of American Greatness, one of the best news information editorial websites out there, but more importantly, for today, an author of
It is a really great website, by the way.
And he's the author of a new book called America and the Art of the Possible, Restoring National Vitality in an Age of Decay. Chris, that's a lot. I mean, I'm sure I've
say
read
that
through
5 times fast.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
What was the impetus of this book?
So I have been thinking about a book to do for a while. This is people say, is this your third book? Sort of. It's like my second and a half. One of them was like real short. It was more like an extended essay. But I kind of wanted to do a book. So I've been thinking about it for a couple of years. And I thought, well, it's sort of a diagnostic type book would be interesting. Everybody talks about politics. Everybody's always talking about, well, this went wrong or that went wrong or whatever. And I thought a lot about that, and I actually had quite a bit of it sketched out, and I realized it was totally unsatisfactory because it was basically just a long complaint. And I didn't like that. And so as I sort of worked through the ideas, I thought, well, gosh, everybody's always talking about the problems. And what I wanted to do was write a book about solutions. And so roughly the first half of the book is descriptive in nature. So it's the Age of Decay, right, in the subtitle. What's gone wrong? Which people love to talk about. But the second half of the book is prescriptive, and it's what can we do to make it go right? Like, how do you turn the battleship around? And so that's when I sort of started to get excited about writing the book, because you're just right about the problems. It's like there's this cathartic element of it where it's like it feels good to complain.
Right.
But when you get to the end of it, it's actually super unsatisfying because you're like, well, okay, now I'm out here, but now what? Right. And so that's why that was actually the harder part of the book to write, was the second half. Everybody knows the problems, though I tried to make them extremely concrete as opposed to making them sort of very 50,000 foot level. It was really hard to start to think about what is, when you think about solutions, well, what are they? Number one, you have to tie them back to the problems you've described. And number two is, how do you come up with something that is also very, it's discrete, it's describable, it's actionable, and it's big enough to matter, but not so big that it's not doable at all. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Fascinating. So in reading, I've read the excerpt that you published on American Greatness, and I'm awaiting my copy. Well, actually, I got the Audible this morning, so I'll start listening to the whole thing. It was fascinating, your treatment of life expectancy.
Yeah.
And how we always talk about how great life expectancy has improved. And what you point out is that taking aside infant mortality, which is obviously way lower now than it was in the Middle Ages and even 100 years ago, but you take that out, our life expectancy isn't all that much better, if better at all,
right,
than it was 100, 200, 300 years ago. And
in fact, in the article, you take it back to ancient times, even in terms of biblical times, in terms of life expectancy, which was a great point, by the way.
Right, and so it does go to the lifestyles we lead, whether it be unhealthy eating, being overweight, having diabetes, or substance abuse, things that are part of the demise, I guess, or the Age of Decay, as people who have kind of lost hope turn to the other things to comfort them or to get them through. What can we do about those issues?
Yeah, let me talk a little bit about that, because the life expectancy thing has gotten a lot of comment from folks who have read that, and the default position, I think, of people is we're living longer, better than ever before, and it's not true. Like it just isn't there in the data, and one of the it's actually the problems are actually accelerating. Maybe 2 weeks ago-ish, very beginning of this year, or maybe it was the very end of December, CDC published new median life expectancy numbers for Americans declined again. It's been declining for 10 years. And so median life expectancy for Americans is, I think it's 75. I think it's 0.3, 0.2 or 0.3. But the point is that it was another decline, and it's been going down for a decade. And I contrasted that. I didn't do this in the book because I didn't have the data at the time, but I contrasted this in a Twitter thread with France. France has been going the other direction. And I picked France for a couple of reasons. One is sort of provocative because Americans kind of like to think they're better than the French.
Right.
So just the provocation was fun.
Yeah.
But the other part is because it's a peer country. It's a very it's a prosperous Western European country that we're all familiar with, and also the French famously have these. There's like the so-called French paradox, which I think has sort of been better explained or debunked or whatever, sort of about their diets. They sort of eat fatty food, and which is supposedly bad. It's not. Depends on the fats, as you know. Right. And they drink a lot of red wine. They also famously smoke a lot. And so you have this situation where in America you've got the median life expectancy declining. It's now down. It's roughly 75. In France, it's been increasing. They just released their numbers at the beginning of the year. It's basically 80.5.
Wow. So
it's about a 5-year, a little bit more than a 5-year gap in the wrong direction if you're an American. But, and then you look at some other data points. 1 in 3 French people is a regular smoker. It's
1 in 3.
1 in 3. It's a third of the country, right? But they're living longer, and you say, well, surely they all have terrible heart disease and diabetes and whatnot. Nope, sorry. They have a lot less of that than Americans do too. Heart disease is the incidence of heart disease is a lot higher in the United States than it is in France. The incidence of diabetes and other inflammatory diseases is much higher, but they're smoking. And there's, well, I don't know, what about the notorious French ennui, the sort of I don't know, Camus philosopher smoking. It does not matter. I will kill myself. Nope. Incidence of suicide higher in the United States too by like 15 or 20%. Wow. And so I look at those things and I think, well, obviously this is like a marker. Something is not going right. It's not. And part of writing the book is saying, hey, we've got to identify life as it is. In other words, these things are happening. And then we can start to think about, well, why and what do you do about it? And when you make the bigger point about life expectancy, there's a few things going on there. The decline in infant mortality, which obviously is a huge gain, right? That's a good thing. But most of that gain took place at sort of the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. It's like effectively a one-time gain. Like you can't really reduce infant mortality more than it's already been reduced because it's quite low. Right. Which is a good thing. And so just the way the math works out is that because when you factor that out, then the median life expectancy increases. And so people looked at the 20th century and said, okay, well, median life expectancy has been increasing. Most of that gain is simply because of the reduction in really early childhood mortality. Right. When you start to look at life expectancy at, say, age 5 or age 10 or something like that, life expectancy didn't change that much. It did increase. And that's what, to the point you were making, when you look historically, people lived, they're famous people, sort of Roman emperors and other people of note in ancient times and in the medieval world, they would live well into their 70s, 80s, sometimes older. And so one of the things I say we should be working on is like identifying, this is at the end of the book, you think about big projects, well, let's set a goal as a country and say, well, we want to get median life expectancy to 100. Sounds crazy because 100 is still super old, but people do it, right? So it's possible. And something that we should be thinking about, like how do we do that? How do we see a world in which people are healthier when they're older? Yeah. So you think about the French-American comparison again. They're living longer, but the older people in France are also healthier than older Americans, much less obese, much less inflammatory disease. So your sort of median 75-year-old French person is more active, isn't on 10 different pills every day. And just to keep heaping the ennui on us, we spend 2.5 times more money per capita on healthcare than the French do. Like we spend more money per capita by far than any other country in the world. And obviously, you say, well, third world countries or whatever, obviously, but just you compare it to like peer countries, Britain, France, Germany, whatever, Australia, Japan. We spend a multiple. It's not like we spend 10% more. We spend 2 to 2.5 times per capita more dollars. When I post about this, you'll appreciate this. When I post about these things on Twitter, I always get the people in the replies, we need universal health care. That's the solution. It's like, we're actually already spending a ton of money on this. It's not a lack of resources.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's not a lack of choice. It's not a lack of like you said, resources and opportunities to turn these metrics around.
Right.
Everyone has that opportunity. It's ingrained in our culture, and it's ingrained in the way we've promoted diet, the way we've promoted different types of exercise, and I hate to say this, and please forgive me, but if you want to see the decline that you're speaking of, go to Disneyland. Walk around Disneyland. I say it every time. I'm like, this is it. This is the decline of America. Not only are we spending money on things that probably don't matter, but we are so unhealthy and not even focused on our health, and yet we think we're progressing.
Right, and that's it. And that's really it. Is people, I think, before you can have a solution, it's the old thing. You need to recognize you have a problem.
Yeah,
there's a problem here that. Like I've gotten pushback from people who are like, they're smart people who sort of generally agree with the premise of the book, and then until they actually see the data, like, no, like basically you're wrong, that can't be, and then they start to look at it, they're like damn, actually I had no idea.
Right. Well, and it's kind of, I mean, it's a symptom of the problem that, I mean, the federal government has been implicit in this, in the sense of you had the food pyramid, you've had all these things that are just really, frankly, unhealthy. I mean, they lead to the inflammatory diseases. Yeah. We have way too much sugar in our diet, refined crap. I mean, I think if people went back to eating a fairly clean way, it would make a huge difference. But just the processed stuff, I mean, we've got a USDA that is essentially owned by the big food producers, and that becomes a problem.
Yeah, I had a long discussion with somebody about this yesterday, about the way food production is done in the United States, and that this is actually it's not only bad for people, it's quite bad for the land too. And like, I've got a riff on this in the book, but basically, like, industrial agriculture in the United States is something that really, well, first of all, was designed by government policy, Republican policy, I might add. And to be honest with you, I think it was for mostly good reasons. Like, the intentions were good. So I don't want to sort of, I don't want to just scapegoat the people who were sort of implemented this policy in the 60s and 70s. I mean, the leading exponent was a Republican Secretary of Agriculture, this guy Earl Butz, who had sort of grown up in the farming business, family farm and that sort of thing. And people were always trying to solve for one problem, which is starvation.
Hunger. Yeah.
Right, for hunger.
Yeah.
And, being, sort of mid-late 20th century, people, like, it was the industrial age, and people think, well, I don't know, like Henry Ford was able to turn out all these cars, like, super efficiently, like, why can't we produce food really efficiently? And, like, it turned out, though, that, like, yes, they solved the problem they were trying to solve for, which is not enough food, but they created a different problem, which is, there was too much, but it was also unhealthy for the people who were consuming it. It wasn't the right food. And then there were things that were just not known that are known now, which is when you start to use a lot of like chemical fertilizers and and pesticides, like that actually gets into the food and into the people, and it causes bad outcomes with the people. And then it also, it also destroys the soil, which causes erosion. It's bad for the water table, and of course that comes back on people as well. I make the point at a certain point in the book. People like to talk, particularly people on the left, about climate change, like macro climate change, Right, but there is almost on a smaller scale, there's such a thing as climate change that comes about within a much, I'm not saying the whole planet, I'm saying like you can change the climate of an area by the actions you take. And that actually is something that we are seeing. Like the Dust Bowl in the 30s was man-made because they stripped the soil off of the top of the ag land in the middle of the country. And then it wasn't able to hold the like native grasses or other or other plants. And as a result, it wasn't able to retain water when it rained, and that's what caused the Dust Bowl. That wasn't an act of God. That happened because of things we did.
We deforested the entire middle of the country.
Yeah, right, exactly. Right? So this is one of my projects, as I say, like terraform. I always say this. Space never interests me. Like people love, like this is one of the things that people are really interested about with Elon. I'm like, people are like, oh, we should go to like Jupiter. I'm like, why? Like that sounds terrible. Like it's really far away. There's actually maybe no land there at all. It's just these noxious gases. Or like, oh no, okay, we should go to Mars. I don't know. Like, why don't we get Iowa right first? And so, is it like a big project that would actually be quite good for the country would be like very ambitious, and there would be a lot of good outcomes, health outcomes, environmental outcomes, and I mean that in the sense of like restoring nature, right? Like a very old school conservative principle around conservation and sort of preserving. The natural world, being good stewards of it, is that we should be looking at big parts of the middle of the country where the soil's been destroyed, where they've been deforested, where the water table's either been sort of poisoned or semi-poisoned and is declining, and we should terraform those areas en masse. It is something that is being done elsewhere in the world. It's been done in the United States on a small scale. When you look at the before-after pictures, it's really stunning. The Chinese government did it at a place called the Loess Plateau. Google it if you're listening and are interested. It's LOESS. Like 35,000 square kilometers. It took them about, I think, maybe 15 years. Dust Bowl, like arid, looks like nothing will live there. And basically they terraformed it, and it's now lush, green, productive. Like it's one of those things until you sort of dig into it, you're like, that's insane. Like you can't actually do that. Actually, you can do it, and we should do it, and we'd be better off if we did things like that.
Right. So this is going to be an interesting component. I mean, when you talk about those types of things, that's not typical of the modern conservatism. You are a traditional conservative, old school, but you are hearkening back to the traditional conservatism. Yeah. That is a lot of this on protecting our natural environment has very conservative roots, but it's been co-opted by,
crazy people.
By radical people. And so there is going to be some within the conservative movement who read what you say about this and immediately, whoa, wait a minute.
Right.
And I think it's an important education process that you're embarking on to help us understand. This is, true conservatives want to make America the greatest place on earth, and we're not going to do that by destroying it.
Right. The
natural resources. I mean, we have to have a sustainable place to live.
Well, and what I was going to say is that and bedrock conservatism is what we say on the show all the time. It's about faith, freedom, free enterprise, and the co-optedness of conservation policy has to do with controlling the free enterprise system. Right. It's nothing more than really creating a new economic system that's dominated by government intervention versus creating incentives and opportunities for real conservatives to conserve.
Well, you think about it. I mean, every few years when the Farm Bill comes up in Congress, that is government injecting itself directly into the free market.
How many lobbyists have gotten rich off the Farm Bill?
All of them.
All of them, right? All of them. Right. Which reminds me of my favorite government joke, Sean, which is, you know how many people work at the post office? About half.
Well, I was going to say nobody.
Right. Well, half are employed, nobody works.
Right. Yeah.
Just kidding, postal workers. Yeah, sorry.
But I wanted to kind of get to that because you touch on it a little bit in terms of societal changes, and you kind of take California in your piece to the woodshed in terms of the dynamic change that began in the 60s and in terms of societal changes. And you kind of dance around it, but I think what you're really trying to get to is, we've changed in a country in terms of our faith institutions and our belief in our faith institutions. And that has led to a drastic societal decline as well. And you touch on it a little bit, and it began in the 1960s. In terms of a move away from the family unit, moving away from traditional institutions, and you make a really interesting correlation between Charles Manson and the Beach Boys and as like the high point of decadence in the 1960s. Can you talk a little bit about that and in terms of how that looks for renewal?
So read the rest of the book, because there's if you're interested in that subject, there's a lot more on faith institutions and how they might be revitalized, intentionally. I think it's extremely important. The California thing is.
Well, 300,000 people left California last year, over 300,000. So, California, the California experiment right now, as we see it, is what was in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s is now, the bill's coming due and people are leaving.
Yeah, so I frame it this way: is basically the big American project that took us 300 years ish was basically conquer the continent and build a country that spans from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And so there's so much of American history and of the way we spend our resources, sort of time, talent, treasure, the way we thought about who we are was a frontier nation and a frontier people, and you're just moving progressively west, west, west. And that ends in California, like it physically ends in California. So you get to the Pacific, California, and this, like I say this a couple places, I think it's true, is California is the apotheosis of the American dream. Like it reached its high point in California. It really did. Like California was the promised land, especially like on the coast. It's, there, but also you think about the Central Valley in California, it's the most productive agricultural land in the world, bar none.
Right.
It is beautiful in California. You've got beaches and mountains, and you've got everything. And then after World War II, a lot of people stay in California. They sort of solved the water problem, because California is arid, even as late as the 10s and 20s, the 1910s and 1920s. Los Angeles didn't have enough water to support 100,000 people. Mulholland solves that problem. Then after the war, people stay. Right, people had already been flocking to California. You have all these GIs returning from the Pacific, and they wind up staying. And the defense industry is famously headquartered in California. And all of a sudden, then the boom happens. Right, it just explodes in growth. It's basically where the subdivision is, if not quite invented, is sort of perfected.
Yeah, right.
There's a really interesting data point here, which I can't remember if I say it in the book or not, but I discovered this by reading about this. When the original subdivisions were being built in California, think about like in the San Fernando Valley, or even in the immediate suburbs of LA, the floor plans all had the kitchens in the front of the house with a window overlooking the front yard. And the reason is because the assumption was the kids in the family, that there would be children, number one. Mm. Number two is that the kids would be in the front playing with the other kids in the neighborhood, and the mom would need to be able to watching them. Yeah. By the middle 60s, the floor plans had changed, and the kitchen was in the back of the house with that same window looking into the backyard. Hmm. And so there's like an exteriority thing going on there, and it's physically represented in the houses about how people went from being like high trust to being low trust in the course of about a generation. Then the thing you were talking about with Manson is like you have the 60s in California, which is like this is where things really start to change, right? You have the counterculture being sort of famously birthed in San Francisco, though, it had started, like California's got a very weird counterculture history that started way before the 60s. Like, I can remember if this is in the excerpt you guys read or not, but one of the founders of JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. Was this in the excerpt? Is this guy Jack Parsons, like sort of brilliant scientist and very classic California guy, founding this new like tech type institution, but also was the leader of this occult society in Pasadena where they practiced thelmic magic. They were kind of like evolutionary followers of Aleister Crowley. It was a big deal. Sort of subterranean, but it was like important people were a part of it. He was. L. Ron Hubbard was his roommate, lived with he and his wife.
Yeah, you mentioned that.
Founder of Scientology. And, Hubbard sort of kind of takes on board, like, God, this guy's getting girls and it is important. And because he's running this thelmic magic society out of his house in Pasadena, like, I think I could one-up him. I could one-up him, yeah. So people always think like the counterculture is Haight-Ashbury in like 66, 67, 68 and like Jerry Garcia, and that's true, obviously, but there's a lot of stuff in California history that like legitimately deserves its own book. And then this is the thing that like blows people away is you have Manson and the family living with Dennis Wilson, one of the Beach Boys in Malibu for the summer of 68, Summer of Love. Which is it's perfect California for the time. It's like they don't know what the Manson family is at this point because the murders are the following summer. But then by the summer of 69, you have Apollo. We land on the moon in June. We have August 8th and 9th. We have the murders of Sharon Tate and the others at the Tate Polanski house, which, by the way, was Doris Day's son's former home. And then a week later, you have Woodstock. And it's like the way I think about this, I say, this is where everything changed for the country. Like the trajectory changed. You want to talk about an inflection point? It was right there, and there was a baptism in blood.
Yeah. The national inflection point from coast to coast.
From coast to coast. And because the Manson thing is actually I don't know if people paid that much attention to it now. It was huge national news. It really shocked the whole country's sensibilities.
Because it was
no one had ever seen it or ever conceived it or anything like
well, I mean, it seemed like, well, this is a normal suburban place that is where I live. And this happened.
And there's the California thing, too, because California was the ideal.
Right.
Like it was the Beach Boys, it was Sun.
The Golden State.
Golden State, right. And then, but it ended. That's why I say it hit its apex and it ended in California, too.
Yeah. Fascinating.
Pretty much ended the Beach Boys at that time, too. Much good music after that.
I don't know. I've always been a Beach Boys fan. But there is a lot of history there.
They recorded a Manson song. Do you know?
Yes, I didn't know that.
Yeah, they changed the title and recorded a song. They had already done it at that point by 69, but I think it was recorded in 67 or 68.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating. Well, Chris, this book I feel like is a must read for anyone who cares about the country. Where can they find it?
Amazon, of course. It's a website. I don't know if people are familiar with it or not.
Oh,
Amazon.
.com.
It's .com.
I think that started as a book store.
Yeah.
Right?
It turns out they've got it. I know there are people who don't like to buy from Amazon. The publisher, Encounter Books, you can buy it on their site, EncounterBooks.com. People always say, is it going to take like 6 weeks if I buy it from the publisher? Their fulfillment's quite good, so that's like a few days if you want to buy it from them.
Great.
The important thing isn't the where. It's just buy it.
Yeah. Just buy it. Well, read it. Buy it and read it. I mean, obviously buy it because we want to support you, but also because it has got such an important message. I think, in my mind, probably the most important book. We're here in January, but probably the most important book for 2023 as we look forward to how we move forward as a country.
Thank you.
So, yeah, and American Greatness is just an amazing
project.
Website. I wasn't quite sure what to call it, but there's just, the website has great authors.
We like Web Magazine. If you say blog, Ben, our managing editor, will find you and kill you. It drives him crazy. So we like Web Magazine.
Web Magazine. Yeah. Well, it
it's
is fantastic.
I mean, with amazing writers and good writing too.
Yep. Excellent. Good. Well, thanks for being here, Chris.
A pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
All the best.
See you.